I know I sound like a broken record over here repeating this, but people do not know about the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. And my theory is that World War II looms so large in the 1940s that the Arab-Israeli War kind of just becomes an afterthought. It follows the Second World War a little too closely, and that's everybody's favorite era in history to study. But the 1948 war is an important war, and to the extent that some wars are meaner than others, it was a rather cruel war. There are some details to that conflict that are hard to take. Even still, if there are some realities that are difficult to accept, we need to be strong and read on. So it's an historical fact that during the 1948 war, Jewish forces cleared and destroyed hundreds of Arab villages in Palestine in the Jewish state, but one of those villages gets name-checked more than others, and that's a place called Tantura. Both authors Ilan Pappé and Benny Morris write about Tantura, and incidentally, there was a documentary just a couple of years ago about the Tantura controversy, and it featured Ilan Pappé. Well, since both authors have addressed this subtopic of the war, I felt the urge to give an overview of each of their takes. And so it was that in the spring of 1948, the Zionists began to go on the offensive. They were conquering and clearing Jewish land. They had orders to attack and cleanse land that was allocated to the Jewish state in the 1947 UN partition plan. Now, Ilan Pappé has it that on May 15th, day one of the war, some Haganah intelligence officers showed up at Tantura and they asked the village to surrender to Jewish rule. Well, this was because Tantura, after all, was situated on the geography of the Jewish state. But the village leaders flatly refused to submit to Jewish sovereignty, and then a week later, May 22nd, the Zionist forces returned, but this time they attacked the village. Pappe writes that they went on a rampage. They were killing people in the streets, killing people in their houses, and after the killing spree, when the village finally decided to surrender, the troops gathered multiple small groups of men. They walked them to the outskirts of the village for summary executions, meaning they gave them a death sentence with no jury and no trial. Now, the author explains that the ruthlessness with which the troops carried out their attack on Tantura was rooted in vengeance. It was revenge for previous Arab violence, including and going as far back as the Arab revolts of 1936, which indeed killed hundreds of Jewish people. Now, I'm not so sure that those particular Arabs in the village of Tantura had any connection to the Arab violence that these Zionist troops were so fired up about. It could be, it's plausible, that they were just bloodthirsty and callous. But on the other hand, the Jewish intelligence officers kept files on some of these guys, and they had lists of specific Arabs who were earmarked for execution. Some of them were known combatants who had participated in Arab violence in the past. Some of them were associated with the Mufti, the Arab Nazi, Haj Amin al-Husseini. Either way, they were thought to undermine the Jewish state, especially when there was a pan-Arab invasion imminent. Can I get some water over here? Getting an accurate body count for the Tantura massacre is tricky, even for the experts and the scholars, but Pappe gives us several Arab eyewitness accounts that indicate that somewhere between 85 and 110 people were murdered at the village. Now, he also provides an account from a Jewish soldier who says that he claims to have a memory of burying 230 people. Now, 230 is a lot, especially because there's only 1,500 people living at that village at that time. And what complicates it a little further is that there's evidence, there's lines of testimony that indicate that there were just 2 Zionist soldiers who were responsible for doing most of the killing. Now, when I do an internet search for the figures on this topic, I'm seeing between 20 and 280 people who were murdered there. But I'm also realizing that these tallies are not all that precise. Ilan Pappé, elsewhere in the book, talks about the Deir Yassin massacre. That's another village that was razed a month or so before Tantura. And he explains that over the years, the body count has had to be revised. The scholars and the experts who work on the Nakba and the 1948 war, they've had to cut down those casualties substantially. And I think that's good news.
So we have to be skeptical about everything. Oral history, documented history. I don't think the hierarchy is that a document written by an Israeli officer has more validity than the memory of a Palestinian. They have different problems of authenticity. The one is, the caveat is memory. The other one is authenticity or truthfulness.
Transparency.
Transparency. I wouldn't trust any report coming from the Israeli army. And I would trust the Palestinian testimony, what the Israeli soldier did, much more than I would trust the written report of the Israeli soldier. In fact, I would throw out to the dustbin the Israeli report.
Benny Morris gives us a slight counter or a pushback to the Tantura narrative when he points out that oral and eyewitness testimony is actually considered rather weak and less reliable in the field of historiography, but he splits the difference when he points out that there is documented evidence to show that a handful of Arab POWs were executed in the Tantura village. However, there's no evidence or no reason to believe that there was like a large-scale massacre at the village.
Yeah. There is no document from 1948 which says that there had been a massacre in Tantura. No document. Right. No Israeli document, no United Nations document, no known Arab document, no Western document. And this is at variance with every massacre which I encountered, and I discovered a whole batch of massacres and wrote about them in my book, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem. Every one of the other massacres has a piece of written evidence or at least reference to it. Deir Yassin, Jish, all of them have reference to massacres, either by Israeli observers or Israeli troops, United Nations observers, British diplomats, American diplomats. Somebody refers to a massacre having occurred or even describes the massacre in some way, wrongly or rightly. Here, there's not one piece of evidence from 48 saying there was a massacre there.
He also adds some context when he writes that both sides were doing this. Arab forces were executing Jewish POWs. Jewish forces were killing Arab POWs. People were not taking a lot of prisoners in this war, and I think they just didn't really have the facilities. It was hard to house and feed prisoners of war. It was easier to just give them a bullet. And Benny Morris writes extensively that there were Arab forces who were hunting stray and wounded Jewish soldiers and just killing them to death. There's another aspect to the Tantura massacre that is apparently left out by Ilan Pappé and then filled in by Benny Morris, and that's the fact that there was a night-long battle before Tantura surrendered. There was bitter fighting between the troops attacking and the villagers resisting, and it ended up with 14 Israelis killed, 70 Palestinians killed, and that includes both fighters and civilians. Now, both authors are telling me that Palestinian snipers were shooting at the Jewish troops before the massacre. So before the massacre, yet after the surrender, there were Arabs who were firing their weapons even still. Now, that's no excuse for war crimes or committing murder, but it does make a little bit more sense to the story that if the Arabs continued firing their weapons after the surrender, then the Zionists would feel more reason that they could go into the village and run amok. I also think it's important to mention that the massacre only came to a halt when a nearby Jewish settler turned up at the village and managed to put a stop to the shooting and the killing. His name was Yaakov Epstein. An unfortunate name, but a fantastic guy. The following statements are not from the books. These are just my personal reflections. But when you have a war, and you have a war that involves young men, and those young men have orders to take territory, I think it's just inevitable that there's going to be atrocities. Because when you have thousands of troops, among them there's a non-zero percentage who are going to be low on empathy, high on aggression, low on impulse control, aroused by violence. Obviously, most troops are none of those things. Most young men are none of those things, but they're out there. They exist. And when you have a war that involves conquest, that is kind of the perfect opportunity for some of those horrible instincts to come out.